The following is a land acknowledgement from A.R.T. New York. We would like to take this time to acknowledge that, wherever we're currently located on Turtle Island, otherwise known as North America, we are in occupied territory. A.R.T. New York's membership in the 5 boroughs of New York City operates on the unceded ancestral land of the Lenape, Wappinger, Canarsie, Rockaway, and Matinecock communities. We want to honor and celebrate all of these Indigenous communities, their elders past and present, as well as future generations. We also want to take this time to acknowledge that after there was stolen land, there were stolen people. We want to honor the generations of displaced and enslaved people that build and continue to build the country we occupy today. Since we are gathered today in virtual space, let's also take a moment to consider the legacies of colonization embedded within the technologies, structures, and ways of thinking we use every day. We're using equipment and high-speed internet not available in many Indigenous communities. Even the technologies that are central to much of the art we make leave significant carbon footprints, contributing to changing climates that disproportionately affect Indigenous peoples worldwide. We invite you to join us in acknowledging all of this as well as our shared responsibility to make good of this time and for each of us to consider our roles in reconciliation, decolonization, anti-racism, and allyship. Thank you. The virtual part of the land acknowledgement was written by Adrian Wong of Spiderweb Show in Ontario, Canada. To learn more about whose land you are on, visit native-land.ca. Thank you.
This is Ashley speaking off camera. Welcome to the second module in the Disability 101 series, Disability and Theater. This is the second of 4 modules in this series. And on my slide, I have the 4 modules listed. First, we had what is disability? We are currently on the Disability and Theater module. Third is the language of disability, and the last module is anti-ableism and disability justice. On this slide, I have our goals for this module. In this module, we will learn about the history of disability and theater to understand the intrinsic links between the two, and we will consider the following questions. How has theater been used to perpetuate harm towards disabled people, and how has it been used to empower disabled people? On this slide at the top, we have disability throughout history. And on this slide is a timeline that starts with ancient Greece and brings us through the Middle Ages, the 1800s, the 1900s, the 1950s, and the present. So much of the history of disability is a history of spectacle, and many disability tropes present in theater narratives both shape and reflect society's views of disability. So we're going to be taking a look at a few moments throughout Western and American history and exploring a few of these disability tropes related to beliefs about disabilities at those times. And while we'll be introducing these tropes in relation to a specific time period, all of these tropes are still very much present in stories we tell about disability today. First on our timeline, we have ancient Greece. Now, ancient Greece is considered by many to be the birthplace of Western theater. Stories by writers like Sophocles are still told today, and people's beliefs about disability at that time bled into those stories. Now, ancient Greeks saw disability as divine intervention, and specifically as a form of punishment from the gods. So because of this connection between disability and the gods, a common disability trope for this time period was the magical freak or a disabled person who possesses special insight or mystical powers that are in direct opposition to their disability. An example of this is Tiresias, a recurring character in Sophocles' plays like Oedipus and Antigone. He's a blind man with the gift of prophecy, so he sees in the future, even though he can't see, he can see in another more mystical sense. And his disability and his magic are intrinsically linked and position him as an other, separate from the other more human characters he interacts with throughout the play. Alrighty, moving right along on our timeline to the Middle Ages. So we're going to skip ahead a couple thousand years, and we arrive in the Middle Ages where disabled people were relegated to the outskirts of society. And one of the only ways for them to make a living, besides, begging, was to work as a court jester, where they were mocked and ogled for their disabilities. And again, disabled bodies are seen as something different from and often less than human. So during this time period, one of the most common disability tropes seen pretty consistently throughout history to the present comes from this idea of disability being incompatible with humanity. So in many stories, disability is used as a signifier for villainy. The character is typically one-dimensional, without a reason or a backstory for why they are, quote unquote, evil. Their disability is enough. So think about some famous villains you know of. How many of them have some kind of disability or physical difference? Maybe you thought of Richard in Richard III, whose hunchback, limp, and withered arm are almost physical manifestations of how much of a villain he is. A more recent example is Peter Pan's Captain Hook, another villain defined by his physical difference. Moving right along on our timeline to the 1800s, which, at least in America, is one of the most impactful moments in the history of disability in theater. It was the time of the freak show. Now, while the freak shows had existed in some form or another since the Middle Ages, they became hugely popular commercial successes in the US thanks to P.T. Barnum. Disabled people, as well as non-white people and anyone perceived as physically different, were put on display for the delight, fascination, and horror of white non-disabled audiences. Now, this practice capitalized on the public's view of disability as freakish and non-human. Freak shows are the cousins of more traditional theater performances, and the practice of putting difference on display to be ogled at is common in theater as well. So a common trope during this time period and beyond is the gentleman freak. The gentleman freak is a physically disabled character, often referred to as deformed, who terrifies society with their very presence until a brave non-disabled character befriends them and realizes that, hey, they're not so bad after all. Ironically, this trope does not make the disabled character any more human. They merely become a vessel for the non-disabled, quote unquote, main characters or lead characters' development. A widely known example of the gentleman freak is John Merrick, the real-life subject of The Elephant Man, whose existence throughout the play is a little more than a plot device. Another example of this is Quasimodo from The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Alrighty, I'm going to pass it over to Kirsten to pick up with the 1900s.
All right. Hi, everyone. Kirsten here. We are going to be moving along on our timeline now to the 1900s. I will be occasionally glancing off to the side just to read off of my notes. I want to make sure I get all of this history correct. So the 1900s for disabled people are really defined by what we now colloquially know as ugly laws. These laws began in 1867 in San Francisco, but really reached their peak popularity in the 1900s in the first half of the 20th century. They were instituted in cities across the United States, and their official name was Unsightly Beggar Ordinances. And what these laws did is they prohibited, quote, any person who is diseased, maimed, mutilated, or deformed in any way, so as to be an unsightly or disgusting object, to expose himself or herself to public view, end quote. It's a little hard to hear, I think, at least for me, that language like that has been codified in US law. But essentially what that meant is that for the time that these laws were in place, it was essentially illegal to be disabled in public. In particular, people with any kind of visible disability were prohibited from participating in public life. And this resulted in disabled people really being completely hidden away from non-disabled people, and leading to non-disabled people really potentially going their whole lives without ever, at least knowingly, interacting with somebody who had a disability. And this really I see as being the sort of flip side of the same mindset that led us to freak shows in the prior century. This idea that disabled people are not human, that there's something to be sort of stared at and ogled in certain contexts and completely hidden away and shunned in others. And the visibility or the sort of hyper visibility or invisibility of disabled people is something that is decided on by non-disabled people. So when we're talking about the tropes that come out of this period of history, that come out of this mindset that disabled people should not be seen, we get, of course, the most common disability storytelling trope of all, which is that disabled people are not seen, that disability is not included in the stories that we tell. Recent statistics point to about 2% of roles across all media are written as disabled. And I think that's certainly an increase from, this 100 years ago in the 1900s, but it's still significantly less than the percentage of disabled people that exist in the world. As we've talked about before, about 20 to 25% of the US population has some kind of disability. And so the sort of very real and sometimes, legally codified act of disability being sort of separate from mainstream public life has absolutely bled into the way that mainstream stories have been told. Moving along in our timeline, we're going to talk a little bit about the 1950s, the mid 20th century. And what really defines this era of public life and disability, at least in the United States, are telethons, which really are a modern day freak show. Telethons were these hours long televised spectacles meant to raise money for charities, usually disability focused charities. The most famous of these and the longest running was Jerry Lewis's Muscular Dystrophy Association telethon, which ran from 1966 all the way to 2010. So again, we're really not talking about, far away history here. This is very, very recent history. And these telethons were sort of ostensibly done for the purpose of benefiting disabled people, for, raising money for them. But they ultimately were just another way for disability to be used as a spectacle and a prop for, the non-disabled stars of the show, for them to look like really good people for, what they were doing for these poor, tragic disabled people. So disabled people being used both to raise sympathy and, of course, money. This trope of the disabled person, both as an object of pity and of inspiration, absolutely carry over into many of the stories that we know today. These tropes we can call the wholly innocent. It's, the idea of the poor, sweet, disabled person with the heart of gold are sort of inherently tragic figures because of their disability. They almost always die at the end, and their deaths serving as a way of providing some moral lesson to the non-disabled main characters of the story. Two characters who we see both in literature and in theater sort of embodying this trope. One is Tiny Tim from A Christmas Carol, So this young, frail boy with sort of an ambiguous, non-defined disability, which again, that sort of ambiguity is a trend we'll see here as well. But he ultimately really only exists to teach Scrooge, the main character, a lesson about the true meaning of Christmas. And then Lenny from Of Mice and Men is another one who is sort of this pure, innocent soul who isn't really a person, is more of a vessel for pity from the reader or the audience, and ultimately for a life lesson for George, the true main character of this story. Another trope looking at sort of the ways that disabled people are used to inspire non-disabled people is the trope of the super crip, this disabled person with almost superhuman ability because of their disability, and someone who is so inspirational because of the ways that they can succeed in the world despite this horrible disability, the horrible hand of cards that life has dealt them. This sort of superhuman ability that many of these characters have is not reflected of most real disabled people's experiences. And that can create a harmful narrative that disabled people are only valuable if they have superhuman traits. One example of this trope showing up in theatrical storytelling is the main character of Christopher Boone in The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. Christopher similarly has an ambiguous disability. He's very obviously coded as autistic, but is never explicitly stated to be so. And he has a brain that's essentially a supercomputer. And, the story sort of follows his navigating the world with this superhuman brain. Most autistic people, myself included, don't have supercomputers for brains. And we aren't going to inspire non-disabled people with the way that we go about our daily tasks. This character is really written by and for a neurotypical or a non-autistic point of view. And it doesn't really paint a realistic picture of the autistic experience. So all of that being said, we've spent a lot of time talking about some really heavy history. It's not all doom and gloom. Jump ahead in our timeline now to the present, where, there are still some challenges. And I think something that has really been recognizable as an issue in the past, 10 to 20 years is this issue of cripping up, where non-disabled actors play disabled roles. As we talked about a couple of slides ago, only about 2% of roles are written to be disabled at all. And then about 95% of that 2%, those roles are played by non-disabled actors. In the film world, I think a lot of these roles in sort of higher profile movies are often seen as Oscar bait. A non-disabled actor will take on playing a disabled character, pretty much guaranteeing that they will get an Oscar nomination for how they were able to transform into this, person who does not share their life experience. And I think it mirrors in theater. I think a lot of actors who grip up in the theater world ultimately get award nominations and wins as well. I think we're seeing this less and less in very recent years, but it's certainly a common practice. However, as I said, it's not all bad. And I think in very recent years, especially, the mainstream culture is starting to come around to how harmful this practice of cripping up is and how harmful a lot of the other tropes that we've talked about are. And over the past several decades, disabled artists as well have really been able to start carving out more space for ourselves and have been empowered to tell our own stories in the ways that we haven't historically. And so On my slide right now, I have a super, super small sliver of examples of theater being made by and for disabled people. Again, this is really just a small selection, and I really encourage you to continue doing your own research and connecting with disabled artists and just learning, because there is so much really exciting and rich disability artistry happening out in the world. A few theater companies that really showcase disability artistry are Collab Theater Group, Deaf West, New York Deaf Theater, Family Theater Company, and Theater Breaking Through Barriers. And some plays and musicals that really highlight authentic disabled experiences are How to Dance in Ohio, Cost of Living, Teenage Dick, No One As Nasty, and Shoot. This is far from a comprehensive list. All right, and that concludes this module. In our next module, we are going to be talking about the language of disability. See you in the next one.